All right, let's try this again.
O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Boy, indeed, there's some really powerful, beautiful poetry in the Old Testament. In fact, over 1/3 of the Bible is comprised of poetry. The books of Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, Lamentations, most of the prophetic books are all written in poetry. The Psalms are written completely in poetry, and we love the Psalms. Many people would say their favorite book of the Bible is Psalms. Why is that? Well, what do you think it is about the Psalms and perhaps other Old Testament poetry that attracts us? Why do you like the Psalms? What is it about the Psalms that appeals to you? Some people would say, well, it's because the Psalms are so honest. The psalmist cries out in Psalms 88:14, for example. He feels free to cry out. He says, "Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me?" Yet in the church today, we tend to minimize this emotional dimension, this ability to cry out in despair or despondency. Can you imagine if they called on you to pray and you prayed that psalm? Brother Hayes, would you please stand up and pray? If I stood up and said, "Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me," and then sat back down? They probably never called me to pray. So we tend to minimize this emotional aspect, this ability to be honest poetically and figuratively, emotionally, to be honest with God. Yet the poetry of the Old Testament actually focuses on our emotional response to God, as well as on our emotional response to those who are hostile to God, hostile to his people. Good illustration of this is that years ago, my family and I toured Washington, D.C., and I took the kids to the Smithsonian Museum. And we were in the Air and Space Museum, and there was a nice exhibit display about jet engines and how they work, very logically, all laid out, diagrammed, explaining to us how jet engines work. We went outside the Air and Space Museum, crossed over the mall, and went into the National Gallery of Art. Suddenly, what we're seeing are pictures like this. Here's a beautiful picture here of called the Repentant Magdalene. It's a painting of Mary Magdalene from about the 1600s. Suddenly now, communication style is quite different. Gone are the diagrams and the very clear-cut but cold descriptions of how jet engines work. Suddenly now, we have a painter who's communicating with us through how he uses light. Note the look on her face. Note the shadows. Note how light is done. Note her hand on the skull. Note how the flame of the fire on the lamp tilts away from her. So suddenly now we have a very different mode of communication. Moving from the Air and Space Museum to the National Gallery of Art is like moving from the New Testament letters to the Old Testament poetry. So they're very similar modes of communication that we need to be aware of, and to be aware that the genre of New Testament letters tends to be quite different. It focuses on propositional truth. You can outline it. Point 1, point 2, point 3. Paul argues very logically, rationally through the New Testament letters, but the Old Testament poets are very, very different and write very, very differently than Paul does in the New Testament letters. We can see this difference in this chart here. Notice that Paul, New Testament letters, appeal to logic, while Old Testament poetry appeals to emotion. It's not that Paul doesn't have any emotion, and it's not that poetry doesn't have logic. It's that the thrust, the point, the appeal is primarily logical in Paul and his letters, and it's emotional in the Old Testament poetic books. Likewise, rational arguments are central in Paul, while images are central in Old Testament poetry. And to analyze Paul, to understand what he's trying to say, you need to spend most of your time analyzing syntax and grammar. It's critical, and the analysis of Paul and his letters. While in the Old Testament poetry, what's critical to analyze are figures of speech. So the two are very different. And one of the problems that we see facing Christians today is that often they come into the study of Old Testament poetry with the tools for studying Paul and his letters. That is, they try to use the same method, the same approach with which they studied the letters and bring that into Old Testament poetry. And this leads to some frustration. It is difficult and leads to some bad interpretation and some misunderstanding of what the Old Testament poets are trying to say. Now, poetry is indeed recognizably difficult to understand and to analyze. We have enough trouble with it in English, understanding poetry. And so when you move to Hebrew poetry, where you have cultural differences, language differences, different literary techniques being used, it becomes even more challenging for us to understand. So here in this chapter, we'd like to help you, give you a few elements to look for, point out some of these structural things, some of the literary aspects of Old Testament poetry to help you to analyze it and to understand it, appreciate it, and enjoy it a little better. These elements of Old Testament poetry can be characterized by three central things. This is terseness, or a high degree of structure, and figurative imagery. These three things are central. Let's define them. Terseness. This means that the writers simply use a very limited number of words. They use few words rather than lots of words in their communication. Here's a good example. If you compare Psalm 25:4, show me your ways, Lord, teach me your paths. Notice how brief, succinct, how terse that statement is. Compare this with a narrative text over in Genesis 12. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. So terseness just means they use the minimum number of words. Another critical factor of Old Testament poetry is structure. All poetry has a high degree of structure, and in Old Testament, in Hebrew poetry, parallelism is the central feature in structure. Parallelism just means that you have two lines of text that are placed in parallel to convey a single thought. Now, this becomes important as you study Old Testament poetry because you need to work two lines at a time, two lines by two lines. That's how your thought by thought analysis goes. Most English translations help us this way because each verse is comprised of two lines. So when you get these two lines together in each verse, you want to analyze them two lines at a time. Now, there's several different kinds of parallelism. They use it in several different ways. One kind of parallelism is called synonymous parallelism. This type of parallelism involves a close similarity between the lines, using similar meanings, and so the two mean almost the same thing. Good example, Psalm 2:4. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. Each of these two mean very much the same thing. So we have a synonymous parallelism where these two lines you take together and you have one thought that comes out of these two lines that are synonymously placed together. Another aspect of parallelism is developmental parallelism. And in this type of parallelism, the second line develops further the line of the first. They kind of say A is true, and what's more, so is B. And so you have this development. Psalm 121:3 is a good illustration. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. So I make a statement with A, and they push the statement a little bit further with what they're trying to say with B. That's developmental. Another type of parallelism, very common, is illustrative parallelism. And in this type of parallelism, A conveys your main idea, and B illustrates this with an example. And here you have for the statement, sovereign Lord, my strong deliverer. That's the statement. And then B is an illustration of this. You shield my head in the day of battle. Giving an illustration or example of how God is their strong deliverer. On the other hand, in the other direction, you have contrastive parallelism, in which line B is contrasted with line A. And here we see A, for the Lord watches over the way of the righteous. And then the contrast, B, but the way of the wicked lead to destruction. So contrastive parallelism, also very common. And of course, there's a final category that we just call formal parallelism. And this is kind of a miscellaneous category. And the reason for this is that this is poetry, and we're trying to define it. We're trying to put rules around it, but poetry, by its very nature, doesn't always fall into the categories, and so there's always some miscellaneous, some things that are a little different. And so we have this last category that sometimes our parallelism simply is related by metric considerations. I've installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. So parallelism is one of the key things in analyzing the structure of Hebrew poetry. Take 2 lines at a time and look for one thought in the 2 lines. Another important aspect of structure is acrostics. Now, acrostics are very unusual. We don't see them in English much, but what an acrostic is that each successive line of poetry starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so as you move through a text that's in with acrostics, your first letter, Aleph, will start the first line of your poem, and then Beit, the second letter of the alphabet, will do the second line of the poem, and then Gimel, the third letter of the alphabet, will do the third line. So you'll have these consecutive letters of the alphabet moving down the side. Each line will start with the next letter of the alphabet. It's very noticeable if you write this out in Hebrew to a Hebrew reader. Psalms 34, Psalms 25, 111, 112, 145 are all acrostics. Most of Lamentations is 1, 2, 3, and 4, but not 5. Proverbs 31, 10 to 31 at the end, the virtuous woman, the noble woman, that entire poem is an acrostic. And then the big one, of course, is Psalm 119. In 19, rather than having a verse, each verse with the next letter of the alphabet, we have 8 verses or 16 lines with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then another 8 verses and another 16 lines with the next letter, second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, all the way through the alphabet, 16 lines at a time. And that's the way that Psalms 119 is composed. Note that most of our editors of most modern Bibles, like the NIV, will inform us in a footnote when the psalm is an acrostic and identify this particular psalm as an acrostic. So we've looked at terseness and we've looked at structure. Now we need to look at figurative imagery, which is central and is critical to how we understand the poetry of the Old Testament. Figurative imagery it's the modern medium, really. It's the major medium through which the Old Testament poets communicate. They don't write essays, they paint pictures. And so figurative images are what they use. These figures of speech are how they paint these pictures for us and portray these images. That's how the major means of communicating with us. And so figures of speech don't deny a literal reality. The figures of speech enhance how you communicate that literal reality. For instance, an exasperated mother may tell the kids, you're in big trouble, Dad's coming home and he's mad as a hornet. Now, she can't just say Dad is angry, but when she says Dad is mad as a hornet, she's conveying a certain image of this zeroing in on you, mad as a hornet kind of picture. And we would argue that figure of speech doesn't play down the reality of the situation, but enhances the reality and paints it in a more powerful, more colorful way. And the figures of speech in the Old Testament are doing the same kinds of things. Now, there's 2 major ways that figures of speech work. The figures of speech are usually going to involve an analogy, comparing 2 things together, or they're going to involve a substitution, where one thing is substituted for another thing. So let's look at some of the different types of analogies, and then we'll look at some of the different ways that substitution works. So figurative imagery, analogy, one of the most common things, and one of the ones you may be the most familiar with, are similes. And a simile uses the words like or as to draw a comparison. You're familiar with this. Psalm 42:1, a good illustration. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. So there's a comparison here, analogy, and it's indicated to us by the word as. A metaphor also is going to draw a comparison by making a direct statement, but without using the words like or as. So in a metaphor, you have like Psalm 23:1, the Lord is my shepherd. They're making a statement. They're comparing God to that of a shepherd, but they do it without using the terms like or as. Another form of analogy here, we call it indirect analogy. The fancy word for it is hypokatastasis. And then this is where you make a comparison. You're making an analogy, but you're doing it by just making a direct statement. You're not telling them that you're making an analogy. You just use the statement. For example, if you are to say a simile, you might say the wrath of the Lord is like a storm. You use like. If it's a metaphor, you're going to say the wrath of the Lord is a storm. But if an indirect analogy or hypostasis, you have what Jeremiah does in chapter 30:23, where you just use the storm as the figure. The storm of the Lord will burst out in wrath, a driving wind swirling down on the heads of the wicked. So the storm here means wrath, as in those other things, but they never tell you they're comparing it with wrath. They just use it and say the storm of the Lord. And certainly it's clear to us what they're talking about here. Another figure of speech is hyperbole. Hyperbole is just a conscious exaggeration for the sake of effect. And hyperbole would be like, my tears have been my food day and night. This is an obvious exaggeration to convey just how sorrowful and how terrible this time has been for the psalmist. So that's hyperbole. Another fun figures of speech used in analogy is personification. And personification occurs when human features are attributed to non-human entities. You take something that's not human and treat it like it is. This is personification. Isaiah 1:2, hear me, you heavens, and listen, O earth, where Isaiah is addressing the heavens and earth as if they were people and treating them as as if they could really hear. So this is our analogy figure of speech called personification. Another one's anthropomorphism, and anthropomorphism occurs when God is represented with human features or characteristics. God is given all kinds of human characteristics in the Old Testament. God's described as having hands, arms, feet, a nose, breath, a voice, and ears. Then he walks, sits, hears, looks down, thinks, talks, remembers, gets angry, shouts, lives in a palace, prepares table, anoints heads, builds houses, and he pitches tents. And here we see in Psalm 19, in the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun. So there's all kinds of figurative figures of speech used in regard to God using anthropomorphisms. So now the other aspect of figurative speech is substitution. One is analogy, comparing two things. The other is substitution, where you are substituting one aspect for another in a figurative way. One of the most common here is we call effects in causes, and this is known as metonymy. The fancy word is where you state the effect when what you really mean is the cause. If you have a baseball fan who wants the batter to hit a home run, he might shout out, make me happy, make me happy, make me happy. That's the effect, the cause. What he really wants, what he means is hit a home run, hit a home run, hit a home run. And so we see things like this in Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is David's confession after his terrible sin with Bathsheba. What he says here in verse 8 to God is, let me hear joy and gladness. Now, what does he mean? What he means here is he wants forgiveness. He wants to be restored in his relationship with God. So he's stating the effect when what he really means is the cause. So this is a figurative substitution that we refer to as metonymy. Another one is substitution occurs when a representative part is used. This is called representation, or some people will call it synecdoche. And the poets here then will substitute one part for another. We do this occasionally today, where we'll use a city, say Washington, to represent the entire United States. So we might say, Washington is in trade talks with Tokyo. And so we're using Washington and Tokyo as a substitutive representation of the entire nation as well. And the prophets will often do this. Likewise, there'll be aspects of utensils of war. They'll talk about the bow or the sword or the chariot. And what they really are using that to do is to represent the army as a whole, or military strength as a whole. We see this in Psalm 27. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. So we've seen all of these various different ways of characteristics of poetry. And we've seen the terseness, and we've seen structure and parallelisms, and we've seen the vast array of different kinds of figures of speech that are involved. And keep in mind, this is poetry, so you can't analyze it precisely. You can't define all the different ways that poetry unfolds, but we've given you some basic things to look at, some things that will help you as you move forward with trying to analyze this poetry. So what we do then here is you take all these aspects and you go into your interpretive journey. And so you want to interpret your Old Testament poetry with the interpretive journey like we've done with other genres. But a couple of final reminders of what you probably need to do. First, be sure to identify the parallelism. Study it 2 lines at a time. Take 2 lines to represent one thought. And so study 2 lines at a time and organize the thought of the poetry by each thought conveyed by these 2 lines. Second, locate and identify and visualize each figure of speech. Don't skip over them. Say, what is the figure of speech in this verse? What does it convey? What's the point of it? Is it a substitution or is it a representation? And then try to visualize it. What's the image that the poet is painting? Can you see the image? Can you feel the image? Is it there for an emotional impact? Don't let this slip away, that these images are often there to try and pull you in emotionally into the text. So identify the image, what you think it means, and then let that pull you in emotionally into the text. And then as you go through your 5 steps of the interpretive journey, go over the bridge and come up with a meaning. Try to carry this emotion with you. It's part of the meaning that the poets are trying to convey to us in this wonderful and beautiful poetic text. So the Old Testament poets, there's a lot of it in the Old Testament, and it can be challenging to read and to interpret, but it's very rewarding. Some of the poetry is beautiful and it really reaches us emotionally, speaks to us emotionally. So don't skip it. Challenge it, dig into it, study it, use all of these principles that we've given you, take it through the interpretive journey, and then you get to the end, then apply it to your life so that it'll help you to walk closer to the Lord and appreciate and enjoy Him more and more each day.
Amen.
The Old Testament prophets are for sure one of my most favorite parts of the Bible.
Okay, well, listen to more of that tomorrow. So as we talked about yesterday, we're gonna cram in poetry and wisdom today. So that'll be fun. So I'm very tempted to do assignment 23 just because it talks about Psalm 1, and that's one of my favorites. But I think for the sake of time, we should just stick to some of the practice that helps us identify some of the different poetic features that they just described. And assignment 20-1 and 20-2 each give us an opportunity to practice different elements. So I would say let's just try to do a few of each to kind of get a sampling of both. So let's maybe just do the 4 parallel lines on page 145. And then we'll take some time to do some of the figures of speech on page 147. So starting with assignment 20-1, we'll just do the first few of those. So let me just read our instructions here. Based on the discussion of parallelism in the textbook or the video which we just watched, classify each of the couplets, verses that are in pairs, right? In Psalm 20 printed below. That is, identify each set of parallel lines as either synonymous, developmental, illustrative, contrastive, or formal, which was the miscellaneous one. Note that verses 5 and 6 each have 3 lines instead of 2. Either classify all 3 lines together as one category. Well, we weren't going to get that far. We'll just do the first 4. So let's just take a few minutes, and I know that that video goes fast. I don't know if you guys were trying to keep up and write down the definitions of those. Do we need to review that real quick? as far as what these different types of parallels are? Okay, so real fast, synonymous means the two lines are basically mean the same thing. Developmental basically just means that the second line adds on to the first. Illustrative basically just means that the second line is an illustration or an example of the first. Contrastive just means that the two lines are a contrast to each other, as opposed to meaning the same thing like synonymous. They mean contrasting things. The point is to make a contrast between the two. And then, of course, formal is miscellaneous. Anything else, or it's, I guess, what you put when you can't identify it as one of the other ones. This feels like a cop out, but that was their idea. Does that make sense? Well, yeah. So let's go ahead and just take a few minutes to do the first four, and then we'll share what we got. What'd y'all get for verse 2? May he send you help from the sanctuary and grant you support from Zion.
Synonymous.
You may get anything different than that? An example or an illustration of the first. Robin, what'd you get?
We all got something different.
Interesting. So what's the sanctuary that he's talking about? Maybe. In which case, what would Zion be? Possibly, but Zion's an actual mountain in Jerusalem. So it could be his kind of like heaven on earth, his presence in the temple, that kind of thing. Sanctuary could be like we think of it, the place where we meet with God.
So James, were you thinking help and support are the same thing?
Yeah.
So that would be synonymous.
Yeah, that's what I came away with, but my answer is by no means the end all. But that's kind of what I leaned towards as just another way of saying the same thing. But yeah, we kind of see how this can be a little tricky. Okay, how about the number 3? May he remember all your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings.
That's something like we got now.
Okay. Let's just go around real quick and just say what we got. What'd you say, Robin?
Illustrators.
James W. Oh man, we were on a roll. That would have been twice in a row where everybody got something different. I put synonymous on this one too. So burnt offerings and sacrifices definitely going to be synonymous. And then I guess the key then is when he says may he remember your sacrifices and accept. Remember and accept, are those more or less the same thing?
Yeah.
Maybe if he's thinking of them as distinct, that would be That's true.
All your tax filers. And except your runoff.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. Yeah, I can see that.
It's an example of a sacrifice.
Sure, I can go along with that too. We're really making progress here, aren't we? How about number 4? May he give you the desire of your heart and make your plans succeed.
Development.
I can see it both ways. I put developmental, but yeah, is he talking about two different things, desires of your hearts and the success of your plans? That's kind of what I lean towards, but I could see where you could say, and you know, there's definitely some similarity. So you could go with synonymous. And I think what we're getting at here is, at least my thought on this, the exercise of trying to categorize is not so much for the sake of coming up with a category as it is just giving you a framework to think a little bit more deeply about what is being said. I think it's a useful exercise, even if we're not sure which category to put to slap a label on it. I think it just, if nothing else, helps us to gives us a little bit of a framework to think a little bit more deeply about what he's talking about. That's kind of my take on this so far, especially since there's so many different possible angles. Let's see, number 5. So this is a double whammy. I guess just really quick, I kind of saw these as like complex parallels. So the first and the third line start with may. So I felt like that was a parallel. And then the first 2 lines are parallel to each other. So in other words, you have a parallel within a parallel. So first I said, what is the connection between the first and the second line? And then what is the connection between the first 2 lines and the third line? Does that make sense? So it's kind of like your algebraic order of operations kind of a thing. So let's start with the first 2 lines. May we shout for joy over your victory and lift up our banners in the name of our God. How do those 2 relate to each other?
I put it in Webster because you're shouting for joy and it's showing you that you're lifting up a banner. With that explanation of what joy looks like.
Okay. That was kind of the tricky part that I was wrestling with. What is it? What is this significance of lifting up the banners? I'm not sure, and that's where you could get into historical background. Maybe what did they mean when they did that? I was wondering if it meant we're giving God the credit for the victory because we're lifting up the banners in the name of our God. We're saying, like, not only are we happy about this victory, but we're giving God the credit. If that's the case, I kind of went with developmental. But let me just see if I can take a quick look at a background commentary to get an idea of what the significance of lifting the banners was. Let's see, which Psalm 20. While I do this, James, what'd you get? What was your thought on that? It's 2 different things. Yeah. Okay, banners were used by the Israelites and others, including the Assyrians, as standards of warfare and as an assembly of tribes. In the Egyptian army, the divisions were named for various gods, and the standards would identify the division by means of some representation of the god. Holding high the banners was evidently a sign of victory.
Yes.
Banners are described in significant detail in the text from Qumran. So, according to that guy, it might just be, that might be synonymous. What they are doing when they lift up their banners is just a symbol of their victory. But I don't know, that explanation about the guides, still seems to imply that they're giving God the credit, maybe.
There's something like a little, like,
Oh, I see. Yeah, there's two different expressions of joy. Now we're getting deep. So we're shouting for joy and we're lifting up our banners as a way to express joy of the victory. Okay, I can see that too. How about those first two lines as they relate to the third line?
One of the things.
Yeah, it's kind of like, what's the relationship here?
There is no relationship to the other first two lines.
Well, there's got to be some. I mean, it even starts with May. I don't know. I guess I'm having trouble distinguishing between developmental and formal, because developmental seems to add something. And when there's no apparent relationship, then to me, it's like, well, we've just added something unrelated. Is that developmental? I don't know, maybe not. Yeah, I guess that is. Yeah, that's, well, and maybe it's not the best way to see a parallel. I'm just looking back. Each one of those lines started with May. So maybe that last one is just a standalone. Because each May before is a set. And this might just be another thing that stands alone that's not a parallel, not a parallelism. That's kind of what it seems like now. At any rate, let's go on to 6. So I kind of saw this again as like possibly a compound parallelism, but in this case, the first line is parallel with the second two lines taken together, which might have a parallel in relation to each other. So in that case, I think if that's the right way to look at it, we might want to say, what's the second two lines, the second and the third line, how do those relate to each other? And then how do those two relate to the first line? Does that make sense? So what as he answers him from his heavenly sanctuary with the victorious power of his right hand, how do those two relate to each other? Talking about the anointed. Developmental? Yeah, that's what I'm going with. Anybody getting anything else? And then how did those two relate to the first one? So the connection between, now this I know, the Lord gives victory to his anointed. What's the connection between that and he answers him from his heavenly sanctuary with the victorious power of his right hand? Yeah, I could see that. I first said synonymous because it's like he's given victory and then the second one basically seems to have that same effect of giving victory. But you're right, it does kind of illustrate it, kind of unpacks the process of the victory that's being given. So that makes sense. 7, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. I love that one.
Contrast.
Yes. And that's just cued based on the word but.
Yes.
But we could see more significance in what is the contrast here. Who are we trusting in? Things of this life. Hey, that goes along with our lesson earlier, right? We trusting in the things of the natural world, or are we trusting in God? How about 8? They are brought to their knees and fall, but we rise up and stand firm.
Contrast it again.
And there is a connection going with the last one. So you could maybe even see some compound parallelism here. Those that trust in chariots and horses are brought to their knees. Those who trust in the name of the Lord will rise up and stand. And then finally, Lord, give victory to the King. Answer us when we call. You're saying formal? Anybody else? Yeah, this is either formal or developmental, depending on how we want to squint at it. These two fairly unrelated things, or is there an intentional addition of the second to the first? But I'd probably go with formal, I guess. Okay, that was fun, huh? Let's do a little bit of this next one too. I don't think we should take time to do the whole thing at all. So maybe let's just how about if we just set it, I just set us a timer and we just see how far we get. But for this one, each figure of speech in Psalm 102, 1 through 14, listed below, classify the figure according to the categories discussed in the textbook. So now we're talking about figures of speech. So we have similes. That's where there's explicitly stated, this is like that, or this is as that. A metaphor, that's where there's a figurative use, but it's not stated like this is like that. So basically the same, just structured differently. Indirect analogy, I think that's the one where it's not even presented as an analogy, it's just presented as a figure of speech. Man, what's the difference between that and a metaphor though? See if I can look this up real quick. I have the textbook here. Okay, let me just read what they have here. So simile, again, this figure of speech makes a comparison by using the words like or as to explicitly state that one thing resembles another. Whereas metaphor makes the analogy between items by direct statement without the use of like or as. Indirect analogy, this is a literary device that uses the analogous item without directly stating the comparison. Okay, so here's the examples. So simile, like a gold ring and a pig's snout, is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. So there's the comparison with the word like. metaphor, the Lord is my shepherd. So this is kind of like in between. There's a comparison, but it's not using like or as. Whereas the last one, their analogy was the storm of the Lord will burst out in wrath. So let's just take this one and show how a simile would be different. Simile would be the wrath of the Lord is like a storm. Metaphor would be the Lord's wrath is a storm that's going to get you. I don't know. Whereas the storm of the Lord is this other one. I don't know. Is it just me, or does this seem like not really worth hashing out? I think the importance is that we recognize that when there's an analogy and what the comparison is, as opposed to this just seems like a formal difference that's not necessarily going to give us that, not going to necessarily change our interpretation that much, just to recognize the different types of analogy. I guess the only benefit in practicing this would be to practice noticing that each one of these things, each one of these forms are an analogy. But again, to me, I think that the importance is to recognize an analogy as opposed to something else, rather than hashing out the different forms that an analogy might take. What do you guys think? I'm thinking about not doing this one after all. Does that sound good to you guys?
Yeah.
Does my reasoning make sense why it might not be as helpful to distinguish between different forms of analogy? And I think it's makes sense with our limited timing. So let's go ahead and dive into the presentation on wisdom literature. Sure, speaker's back on here.
This is the final chapter, the final chapter.
Whoops. Okay, here we go.
Well, you have persevered to the end. This is the final chapter, the Old Testament wisdom books. The Old Testament wisdom books include Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. This is a very interesting collection of books, and the texts within them are fascinating. Some of them are fairly easy to understand. For example, look, some of the Proverbs. Look at Proverbs 11:13. A gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. Or how about Proverbs 10:12? Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. These are fairly straightforward, easy to grasp. They seem to have the same meaning for us today as they did in the ancient world when they were first given. But there are some others that are not so easy. How about this one in Ecclesiastes 10:19? Feast is made for laughter, and wine makes life merry, and money's the answer to everything. Really? I mean, is the biblical author telling us that parties and wine and money is the solution to all of life? So obviously this, some of the texts are not as straightforward as others. Some of the texts obviously are going to take some interpretive skill to how to understand. So in this chapter, what we will be doing is trying to give you an overview of the wisdom books and some help then to give you guidelines on how to use the interpretive journey to properly understand and to interpret and to apply the wisdom books. To start off, let's look at the purpose of the wisdom books. And this is important to set the context, the literary context. How do the four fit together, and what is it that the Bible is trying to do with these wisdom books? We'd like to start with a good quote from Derek Kidner. In addressing the wisdom books and how they relate to the rest of the Bible, Kidner says, in other words, in the wisdom books, the tone of voice and even the speakers have changed. The blunt, thou shalt or shalt not of the law, and the urgent, thus saith the Lord of the prophets, are joined now by the cooler comments of the teacher and the often anguished questions of the learner. Where the bulk of the Old Testament calls us simply to obey and to believe, this part of it, that is the wisdom books, summons us to think hard as well as humbly, to keep our eyes open, to use our conscience and our common sense, not to shirk the most disturbing questions. So what we see is that while the imperatives of much of the rest of the Bible are obey, trust, believe, when you come to the wisdom books, you find that the imperatives that God gives to us are listen, look, think, reflect, discern. It's not that the great theological story of the Old Testament, that of God's deliverance and God's grace, is not there in the wisdom books. It's that it's pretty much assumed. They assume that in the wisdom books, and then they build upon that. Indeed, Proverbs 1:7 makes this clear when it starts off and says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The wisdom books then will start with this, starting with the theological foundation. Using the salvation story, the wisdom books then build a practical theology, and there's a stress here on this practical theology for living faithfully and wisely in a very complicated world. And really what the wisdom books are trying to do, the overall goal of the wisdom books, is beyond just giving us specific applications for specific difficult situations, and certainly those are there. But the overall goal of the wisdom literature is to build a godly character, the formation of a godly character that's wise, that has wisdom and the ability to discern what wise, godly living would be in some very difficult and some very complicated situations. So to get a handle on this, let's back up and kind of look at the big picture. How do the wisdom books fit together, and what's the primary focus of each of the books? And I think it is kind of important to take all of them together. So if you start really with Proverbs, which is the basic, Proverbs gives us the basic approach to life. And Proverbs presents the rational, ordered norms of life, the way things normally are. Proverbs kind of tells us here's how life normally operates. For instance, if you work hard, you're going to do well in life. And that's a general basic norm of life. If you're lazy, you're not going to do so well. And so Proverbs presents these norms of life. But notice that these are norms and not universals. There are lots of situations, lots of exceptions that we can think of. For instance, when we lived in Ethiopia back in the 1980s, there was a terrible famine. And for a couple of years, it just didn't rain. So there were lots of very godly, righteous Christians in that country who worked hard, but nonetheless had to experience this terrible drought and this terrible famine. So the guidelines and the Proverbs are giving us what's normally true. And Proverbs is also telling us that operating in a world that's logical and rational, there's cause and effects. If you're lazy, you're not going to do well. It's this kind of world that Proverbs deals with. So Proverbs is kind of the starting point, the basics, the rational, ordered norms of life, and that's Proverbs. The other books now are really going to be exceptions to Proverbs, and they're going to balance Proverbs by showing us those times of life, the exceptions in life, when the rational, ordered norms of Proverbs don't really apply. So exception number one, book of Job, the suffering of the righteous. And the proverbial approach of cause and effect cannot really grasp or understand every aspect of life, especially this, when the righteous suffer. Proverbs says, if you're righteous, you obey God and you work hard, you're going to do well and prosper. But the book of Job shows us that that's not necessarily true all the time, that tragedy does strike even the wise and the righteous. And so the book of Job is going to deal with this exception to the rational ordered norms of life and show us that even in tragedy, what we are to do is to rely on our Creator. So exception 1 to Proverbs is the suffering of the righteous, the book of Job. Exception 2 is Ecclesiastes, and it's dealing with the failure of the rational approach to provide ultimate meaning. And Ecclesiastes it's an intellectual search for meaning. And what Ecclesiastes finds is that if you take a rational, logical approach to life and look at it carefully, examine it carefully, while it may be good on a day-to-day basis and a detail-by-detail basis, that the overall approach does not give you the ultimate meaning of life. In fact, it reveals numerous exceptions and anomalies to the ordered rational universe. That's what Ecclesiastes reveals and discovers. And so Ecclesiastes, after this intellectual search, comes to the end and says that meaning in life is really not found through wisdom itself in the rational ordered search, but meaning in life is only found through a relationship with God. Amen. Exception number 3 then is the Song of Songs and the irrationality of romantic love. And Song of Songs deals with celebrates this wild, irrational, mushy, corny aspects of true love with this young couple who fall in love and are married. And so, boy, you have the rational, ordered norms of Proverbs showing things are kind of distinguished and dignified is how the world works. But Song of Songs is showing you that within this love relationship, this rational ordered approach kind of goes out the window, and they're celebrating this wild, irrational, mushy aspect, and also saying that this is wisdom as well, that this part of life is also included in what godly, wise living is all about. Now, a couple other things to remember that in wisdom, that this is poetry. We talked about poetry in an earlier chapter. Remember, there's parallelism involved, there's figures of speech involved throughout the wisdom literature. And we want to remember how we dealt with some of the poetic aspects in an earlier chapter. The figures of speech, too, are a little bit varied. And what you find is that figures of speech occur more frequently in texts that are more emotional. And so these wisdom books are kind of on a spectrum. Proverbs is very rationally ordered, not so emotional, kind of straightforward. And so it does not contain near as many figures of speech as you find, say, on the other end of the spectrum, the Song of Songs, which is dealing with the very highly emotional issue of romantic love. So if you're in Song of Songs, you're going to have figures of speech in almost every verse. And they will dominate the text, and in interpretation, you'll be dealing constantly with these figures of speech. In Proverbs, you have some, they do show up some, but they're not nearly as dominating as you find over in the Song of Songs. So be aware of the figures of speech, be aware of the parallelism, that we're really taking 2 lines at a time as you study the text, and then be aware of the other aspects, that this is poetry, and there will be a lot of figurative language there. So what we'd like to do is in 2 of the books, let's walk them through the interpretive journey and see how we would deal with each step of the interpretive journey, kind of in general, what passages from these books would look like as we go through the interpretive journey, and see how that helps us to read these very fun, engaging wisdom books, and how we can use them to build character in our lives so that we can be wise and lead godly lives. So let's look at Proverbs and walk through the interpretive journey. Step 1, grasp the text in their town. One of the things we need to do is make sure that you explore the literary context. And by that, I mean, keep it in the context of the rest of the wisdom books, and realize going into the book of Proverbs that you need to balance them with those other books, and that these are not universals. These are not promises, but these are guidelines, and these are the norms, and that there are some exceptions. Also, it's helpful to note the structure and the basic units in the book of Proverbs, that The first 9 chapters, for instance, is basically a father giving advice to his son. And so the units are longer here, sometimes chapter long units that you would be dealing with. It's only when you get to chapters 10 to 29 that you have this 2-line verse at a time kind of miscellaneous collection of proverbs, typically of what we think of as a proverb. So if you're in that section, you're dealing with shorter units, just a verse at a time, while in chapters 1 to 9, you're probably dealing with a bigger unit, a chapter at a time. Then, of course, at the end, from 31 to 31 verse 9, you have the sayings of an individual, Agur, and one called King Lemuel. And likewise, these are a little bit longer units that you would be dealing with, a longer unit at a time. And then the final closing chapter, of course, is this wonderful one on the life of noble character. And that one also should be taken as a whole unit. So if you're in chapters 10 to 29, sometimes you're dealing with a verse at a time. They almost stand alone. But in the other sections of Proverbs, you need to deal with the literary units that's there, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes an entire chapter. So note the structure and the basic units of the book when you're beginning here in step 1, grasping what it means in their town. Now, as you come to measure the width of the river to cross, a couple of things. Some of the Proverbs, of course, are already pretty universal, and sometimes the river is small, but there are some differences. Number one, Proverbs is written against an agrarian context, assuming that most of the readers, most of the people are farmers, small farmers, and so there's a lot of agrarian-related Proverbs, and so, many of us today don't live in that situation. We live in urban settings, so we have to notice that change. Also, Proverbs has many references to kings. And assumes that the readers are living in a monarchy. And so for us today in democracies, it's a different government setting. So we have to be aware that that particular difference between our situation and the situation in Proverbs. As we move to step 3, cross the principalizing bridge. Well, the typical Proverbs, many of them are already in a very general principle. So a lot of times the statement of the proverb, it's dealing with things like honesty and friendship and how you speak, and don't slander people and always tell the truth, work hard, respect other people. These kinds of proverbs are usually already stated in general principle, so they come across without a whole lot of change. We create their principle, and really they come across looking very much the same because they're already stated in a principle form. But keep in mind that these are not promises. These are not universal promises. God is not saying, if you work hard, I will indeed bless you with prosperity. That's a health and wealth gospel that the New Testament speaks against. So they're not promises. They're guidelines. They're principles that say this is the normative way of life. This is the advice for how you should live life. So keep that in mind as you formulate these principles and come across on step 3. Step 4 is we consult the biblical map. Many of the themes in Proverbs, most of the themes in Proverbs are reaffirmed in the New Testament, and they're reinforced there. So you move through the New Testament, a lot of times the principle stays very much the same. But this theme of wealth as a blessing from God does undergo an alteration and does change as you move from the Old Testament to the New Testament. In the Old Testament, as the people go into the Promised Land, God tells them that if they're obedient to Him and they follow Him, stay faithful to Him, that He will bless them. And so there is this blessing promise that if people are faithful, then they will prosper, and there's a certain material blessing that's promised. When you get to the New Testament, that promise is just not there. The promise of wealth blessing is kind of dropped, and there is this ultimately an eschatological blessing that in the kingdom to come, that will be the time when the followers of Jesus Christ will be blessed. In the meantime, following Jesus Christ may mean foregoing wealth and giving up wealth and giving up all, picking up your cross and following Him. So we have to be careful if we're carrying this theme of wealth across the bridge when we come to the New Testament to realize the New Testament does qualify that theme. So step 5, grasp the text in their town. And here, again, you want to catch the big picture that the text is telling us not just things to do, specific things to do, which is important, but it's telling us how to be, what to be, how we should be thinking, looking, approaching life. What are some of the general characteristics that we should embrace in our character as we live? So when we grasp the text here in our town, then we want to be sure that we're concerned with our character development. So that's Proverbs, and it's a fairly straightforward, little easy book to read. let's look at another one now. Let's walk through the book of Job and walk it through the interpretive journey as well. When we come to Job now, remember that Job's basically a story, and it's a complete story, unlike Proverbs, where you can pull out individual verses in the middle and make perfect sense of them, study them, and apply them. In Job, you just cannot do this. You have to situate your smaller passage into the larger context of the whole story. You have to take the whole story as a whole. And again, here's kind of how the story unfolds. In chapters 1 and 2 to 2:10, Job is afflicted. Here's how the story starts. He loses everything. His life crashes. He has these terrible tragedies happen in his life. So that's the opening part of the story. Then in 2:11 to 37:24, a big bulk of the middle of the book, then Job and his friends search unsuccessfully for a rational answer. They are really using the book of Proverbs, theology, the kind of thinking in Proverbs that things are rational, ordered, logical. And so Job's friends think if terrible tragedies have happened to Job, then he must have done something wrong. That's their conclusion. Job knows he hasn't done something big wrong, and so he's puzzled and baffled, and what he does is he questions God's justice in this. So they have this long search where they are searching unsuccessfully for some kind of rational answer to what's happened. The final answers actually come in Job 38:1 to 42:6, and this is the most important part of the book, because here is where God comes and answers Job's accusations. And God will tell Job, look, you need to trust me that I'm sovereign and that I know how to run the universe. And so we really get the ultimate answer to the book and how to approach the tragedy of suffering in this section from 38:1 to 42:6. And then at the end, God restores Job completely and has a rebuke to his friends, kind of exonerating Job and returning Job to the situation that he was at the beginning of the book. So let's walk it through then the interpretive journey. Step one, as we grasp the text in their town, again, you have to identify the literary context. Where are you in the book? Be careful of pulling text out of the middle of the book and trying to interpret them independently of the entire story. And remember that the central lessons don't come until you get to 38:1. 42:17, where God speaks and God gives the explanation. He gives the answer. He's the one that shows that their rational search for an answer is futile. And at that point, they have to trust in the sovereignty of God and trust in the character of God. So that lesson doesn't come until 38 to 42. So, and keep in mind too, as we grasp the text that near town in the first part, that the Job's friends are negative. By and large, they're negative characters. They kind of miss the boat. They misapply the theology of Proverbs to Job's situation. So they're not models for us to be followed. They're kind of negative characters. So as we move to step 2, to measure the width of the river to cross, actually the river's not that wide on some points. I mean, suffering and tragedy is very universal. So there's a sense in which human tragedy and human suffering is very similar in the ancient world as it is now. What we have to be aware of in measuring the width of the river is that we cannot assume that since Job's tragedy was connected to satanic involvement, that all tragedy and all bad things that happen in our life are likewise connected to satanic involvement. Occasionally, bad things happen in my life just from my own dumb mistakes. And so sometimes what's needed is just a recognition of that and repentance. But unexplained tragedy and undeserved tragedy and just the normal chaos that happens in life and terrible things that seem to happen, inexplicable tragedies that happen in life do seem to be somewhat universal. So in that sense, the river's very narrow when we're just dealing with tragedies. As you cross the principalizing bridge, okay, here again, since tragedy is so common that usually the principle will be fairly straightforward. And when you get into that section, when God speaks from 38 to 42, the principles that he shares with Job in there about trusting in his control of history and trusting that God is just and trusting that God's character is what you should rely on. These are fairly universal principles, easily formulated, and we come across with very similar principles for today as we had in step 1 and the way Job would have understood it. So step 4, we consult the biblical map. As we've mentioned in Proverbs, the New Testament doesn't repeat this picture that peace and prosperity comes as a result of righteous living. And the New Testament suggests really that righteous people glorify God by enduring their unjust suffering. So the New Testament takes the theology of Job to trust in the sovereignty of God and to trust in God's control and to trust that God is indeed just. And it adds another component that says sometimes righteous people in following Jesus Christ will have to endure suffering, and they can indeed even glorify God by the way that they endure this suffering. And then this brings us to step 5, to grasp the text in our town. And remember that our focus in grief then should not be on the why, but it should be on God and his character. We should be trusting in God, that he knows what he's doing, that there is justice in the universe, and we should rely on God when we don't understand what's happening in life. And that application is good, easy for us important for us to grasp in tragedy. And another application that comes out of this is that Job's friends really kind of missed the boat as far as comforting him. And so we should realize that when our friends are suffering, that we should hurt and suffer with them. We should not expect to come up with some kind of logical explanation always for what's happened. But again, we should trust in God, but we should be with them, hurt and suffer with them. And these are the applications when we come into step 5. So the wisdom books, the summary, Proverbs presents the norms, the rational ordered norms of life. And then the others, Job, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, present the exceptions, these exceptions. And we take these as a whole. Taken as a whole, they cover all of life. And these wisdom books then are fascinating and interesting and challenging. And they give us all kinds of helpful guidelines for building wise and godly character in our lives so that we can lead a day-to-day wise, godly life and live for the Lord with wisdom in today's very complicated world that we face each day.
Yeah, that's fun. Any questions or elements that anyone would like to go over from that? I think some of that overlaps our discussion in the first half of our class where we talked about those different books in the wisdom genre. And we definitely don't have time to go through an entire exercise here. At least not in the way we normally do it. Maybe instead of taking time to write stuff down and then come back and discuss it, we can just pick one of these and just discuss each step briefly together.
That sounds good.
I don't know, I'm sort of drawn to Proverbs 18:24. Page 169. First, let's identify the parallelism. What kind of parallel is this? Yep, it's contrast. I'm trying to pull up on my screen for the video this exercise. Here we go. All right, so it's a contrast. Let's go ahead and talk about step one. What does this text mean to the biblical audience? Any thoughts?
Hatred just makes it complicated, bigger, it makes it. To me, conflict would be like pulling more people. It's with it.
Oh, okay, I think
What are we doing?
we're doing the one on 169,
Oh, okay.
Proverbs 18:24. Sorry. So, yeah, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. I guess we probably should have just read through it first. You guys see that one on top of 169? So, again, it is a contrast. We just see that there's that word but. So meaning for the biblical audience. Go ahead. What do you think the meaning was for the biblical audience? How would we what might we sum up as grasping the text in their town? What did this mean to them?
Well, you have to define the friend, to be God.
I think there's a hint at that, but I would say there's kind of a couple different levels here. And this is where it might get a little bit tricky. For the biblical audience, it might just serve as a kind of like he was saying, a general norm that your friends can affect your well-being. You know, if you have unreliable friends, that can cause you problems. But on the other hand, there are friends who can be even closer to you than family, which is, you know, saying a lot, especially in this culture. So kind of be careful who your friends are would be the general takeaway. Job was probably written before this. Job is thought to be one of the earliest books written of the Old Testament.
Did the biblical audience have Job?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. You know, and it's kind of an interesting question too, because the way that our speaker presented it, he kind of lays Proverbs as a foundation, and then Job and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon are talked about as exceptions to that. But that's not necessarily to say chronologically Proverbs came first and then these other things were written.
Well, I was thinking if this biblical audience had Job, they could look and say, aha, look at his unreliable friends. I mean, you know.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, this is an illustration. You need to be careful to
Yes.
have company with.
So regardless of which was written first, I would say this is probably not a direct reference to that writing in Job. You could see that as an illustration of this, but I would say the original audience, this would just resonate with their daily experience of, you know, they've had friends that, you know, let them down. You know, a lot of the Proverbs are especially written for a young audience. You know, it's kind of like, young man, you know, pay attention to your elders. And so hopefully you're speaking to a young audience who hasn't had to learn this lesson the hard way. And this is like the older generation trying to help them to not have to, you know, have the negative effect of unreliable friends. So you could kind of see it play out just in a very almost like common sense, just passing wisdom from the older generations to the younger generations. Be careful who your friends are. Again, is kind of how I would sum that up. So let's measure the width of the river to cross. What might be differences between the biblical audience and us? Well, I would say in some ways, on the just the natural level, there's not a lot of differences. Your friends can still have a big impact on you. Unreliable friends can still have a very negative impact, and close friends can be very valuable. I think the thing that maybe is, I don't know if I would say this is a difference, or if it's even in the original audience, there's a natural and spiritual dual meaning here. It could be that coming from the new covenant, we see a spiritual significance of this in our relationship with Christ. But it could be that was the original intention of the Holy Spirit, even at that time, was to contrast human friends who are all flawed with the friend who is sticking closer to his brother.
I think he was talking about Jesus.
So yeah, I don't know where to land on that.
You know,
It might have been that was the original meaning for the original biblical audience, for those who might have had ears to hear. But if not, if this is more of a significance that plays out for us, you could say that is a difference. Otherwise, I don't know that I could think of any differences. So let's cross the principalizing bridge. What's the theological principle here? When we say theological principle, that tends to relate now to the spiritual element of this, but I think there's still an element of spiritual application even to the natural meaning. In other words, it's kind of like Paul warns, that bad company corrupts, so spiritually speaking, even, you want to have reliable friends, and maybe even the reference to family could not only be a reference to the friend, Jesus, but even the family of the body of Christ are those who are supposed to, stick close together. But in any case, be careful who your friends are, and with an emphasis on valuing the most important friendship that we have in Christ, and how that affects our entire eternal lives, much less natural lives. Any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, Christ wasn't revealed, of course, in the providence yet. But what we can see is that even within the body of Christ, we need to select our friends very carefully, because we don't know where they're at, some of the time in their development, where their relationship with Christ.
I'm gonna challenge.
And-
I'm gonna go ahead.
And okay, right. I think the character of Christ needs to be fully revealed in us. We can go around. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
As you're talking, I think I may have thought of another difference.
Okay.
I was just thinking of Jesus, who was called the friend of like tax collectors and sinners, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that could be a difference between the Old Testament audience, the biblical audience of the Old Testament, and us in some ways. So on the one hand, In the Old Testament, your common sense is like you want to surround yourself with people that are a benefit to you, right?
Yeah.
In the new covenant, perhaps there's an exception to that where you are willing to not just spend your time with people that are a benefit to you, but maybe to who you can be a benefit to them, possibly even at your own detriment, right? So whereas the original context, it's all about ensuring your well-being, whereas kind of like he was saying, take up your cross and follow me, upside down version of the new covenant, what we see modeled in Christ is maybe you do befriend those who you're not friends with them so that you can benefit from their reliability, but who you can be a benefit to.
Yeah, I know. I know that, but we obviously the mind, we still need to be careful with the company. Of course, God's gonna call you to be communicative and loving to people that are marginalized, or maybe that they have quirks that, maybe that are a turn off to other people. I mean, just as an example. But
I think both. I think it gets more complicated where we, again, as we've been saying the whole time, we're going to have to rely on the Spirit to be able to befriend unreliable people, but maybe still have some boundaries in those relationships so that we're not just, putting ourselves in
harm's way.
in situations that God might not be leading us to. Maybe we do have an inner circle of those we can trust and we can rely on. Nevertheless, we do extend ourselves beyond that to reach out to others as Christ leads, and we just got to trust in Him to protect us. I think there's definitely a lot of complexity that could come out of that. But certainly, I do think there's a lot of difference between the straightforward original application and how this translates for us as in the new covenant in our relationship with Christ. There's like a lot of dimensions that we're touching on here. So this is a really interesting one.
Well, of course, his whole ministry is full of loving and unlovely,
Yep.
But I don't know that I have a full development of the character of Christ in me yet either. So this is where the relationship with the Holy Spirit is found.
And I would say that there's perhaps a process of maturity that plays in here. I use this kind of counsel when I'm talking to people in recovery, that there's wisdom that might play out at different, stages of that. If you're first just trying to get sober, you're your first, week, first month, maybe even first year. Yeah, it's not time to minister to all your fellow addicts. It's probably time to, get some strengthening, and then maybe be equipped to go back out and serve. And maybe there's a process for that. But anyways, we're kind of already talking about step 4 when we're with our discussion here. We've talked about other scriptures, how that plays in, how the New Testament might modify it. And we've also just mentioned at least a couple of examples of how this might play out in our modern time. So that's all we have time for. I do think we kind of did a quick version of hitting all those steps. So good talk. Father, thank you once again for today. Thank you for this time. I pray that we'll hold on to these lessons, both related to studying poetry, as well as wisdom literature. Thanks for the little bit of practice that we got. I just trust that you're going to give us lots more practice opportunities as we continue to be lifelong students of you and of your communication through the scriptures, Lord. So help us to take these principles with us to continue to apply. And I pray that you'll keep us close to you. God, I just lift up each one of us. I want to also lift up Dale and others who aren't here. keep us abiding in your presence, Lord. For some of us who may not be back until next week, I just pray you'll, protect us, watch over us. We just entrust ourselves into your care. In Jesus' name. Amen.
You're gonna print out the